In the last lecture, we looked at the system of identity politics and the new regime that was created under the Great Awakening. In this lecture, we'll look at conservative critiques of each. It begins with the logic that lies at the heart and the center of the identity politics system. The first criticism of identity politics is that the dialectic at its center is the source of miraculous thinking and ultimately is nonsensical when applied concrete details. If we were to reduce it to a syllogism, it would be Western logic looks for absolute truth, it generates an absolute other, and therefore it must oppress its other. And so identity politics is guilty of a categorical error. The logical principle of non-contradiction differs from moral virtue or political justice. This just makes sense. You can have someone who's a philosopher or a scientist, and that person may not be a good person, a morally good person, and that person may be an unjust person. The pursuit of absolute truth that we find in the Western tradition is one of its greatest elements. What you find in science is that the greatest scientists and the greatest scientific minds, they are trying to fundamentally understand reality. They do think they're uncovering absolute truth, even if it's only in systems that approximate reality. We need to be clear here. We're not talking about simply the assembly line scientist who's collecting data at the medical foundation, but the greatest innovators in the Western tradition that have contributed to it. Identity politics and race and gender actually contribute their own absolute metaphysical teaching. They talk about systems of race and gender, and these become metaphysical truths that lie beyond or behind the appearances, the empirical facts. In one example of this, Michael Eric Dyson, in criticism of Joe Rogan, who had talked about shades of skin in his commentary to Don Lemon on CNN, had argued that they knew there was no such thing as absolute biological essences or metaphysical essences. Rather, they talked about the black experiences from which they proceeded to understand systemic racism. But there again, what we see is they're talking about the black experience, a certain absolute understanding that all blacks must participate in, and a certain system that they must accept and contextualize all of their experiences within. The identity politics crowd claims to overcome binaries, but actually, their claim against binaries produces its own absolute binary of an oppressed other and the absolute same or whiteness, which must be extirpated, confessed, and done away with. When applied to morality and law, critical race theory, or critical legal studies that developed in the 1970s, they teach moral impartiality as white racism. Critical race theory or critical legal studies that began in the 1970s and the 1990s proceeded from identity politics, and they teach moral impartiality as white racism. But morally, it undermines the benevolence, the moral culpability, and the individual merit that make a diverse society possible. In terms of law, critical race theory and critical legal studies seek to overturn the individual freedoms, the equality under the law, and the due process protections that have made the West what it is and provided for the greatest amount of happiness in human history. Psychologically, identity politics monopolizes the symbols of identity to assign individuals group privileges and different rights and overlapping identities. But that also means that it has to suppress conflicting empirical science on health, on race and sex differences. For example, at medical schools, the reference to, quote, birthing persons that makes very little sense. We find the studies on gender dimorphism. It used to be that 0.001% of the population was diagnosed with gender dimorphism, where an individual feels as if he or she is trapped in the body of the opposite gender. And yet what we've seen is this increase in the number of cases. Now it's 2% of high schoolers, and the vast majority, instead of being those who are diagnosed, instead of being male, are actually females. Adolescent girls, in claiming to be gender fluid, have proven to be particularly susceptible in their high schools in which they're pressured. And in these schools, they're encouraged to experiment with their gender identity. They tend to come out as gender fluid or as trans, as their friends do the same, with no history of gender dimorphism in their own childhood. And of course, there's a whole cottage industry of cosmetic surgeons and therapists who rush in to affirm, and this is this affirmation therapy, who rush in to affirm that these young people are correct in their confusion to claim that they're gender fluid. And they give them puberty blockers, which have long-term effects, such as sterilization or osteoporosis. If you read Abigail Schreier's Irreversible Damage, 100% of those who take puberty blockers go on to take a course of testosterone. Once you've stunted your own development and you've gone that far, there really is no going back. And so we trap children into these long-term decisions for which there's a 20 to 40% attempted suicide rate. There's another approach to the authority of health claimed by experts. On the new right, it's called check out the fizz or look at the fizz. And what they mean is the physiognomy of the person who's speaking. It is to say, before you listen to what they say, just look at that person. See what they look like. Are they truly healthy? What you find is that those who often lead at these leftist rallies, those who show up, or if you look at Antifa mugshots, these are often broken people. And so these broken, angry people often act in a passive-aggressive manner. They introduce themselves by proclaiming their vulnerability. Hi, I'm Mike, and I'm gay. Hi, I'm Betty. I'm trans or gender fluid. And so by presenting themselves as a victim, they then sucker you into all the aggressive demands that they proceed to make. Now you have to affirm them with gender pronouns that you have to remember. In some cases, it's not either female or male. It's words that are taken off of descriptions of animals or things that individuals just make up. And so in a conversation with those on the left angrily demand that you affirm and recognize them. And thereby, you say, my own way of life is no better than yours. And so you're expected to defer to them, and they attain the moral high ground in these exchanges. And so ultimately, psychologically, these demands for confessions of privilege are a way of tyrannizing over one's mind and identity. One way we find this is in diversity statements, where if you apply for a job or for some kind of academic program, you have to tell the narrative of your life within this authoritative system. You have to explain how you yourself were oppressed and you understand the plight as best as you can of the oppressed and that you will help to affirm them. Or you have to confess your white privilege or some kind of a privilege and say how you are aware that you need to do better, you need to do penance, and you need to side as allies in anti-racism or anti-sexism with those who are oppressed. Think about psychologically what goes on. If you see any of these videos of 8-year-old white kids rapping at poetry slams about how they are infected with white privilege, think of the kind of gnarled, puritanical soul with an inverted will to power who wants to hear that kind of confession. And think about the mangled child mind who's going to identify with the sins of his people, even if they're people he's not even related to, or if they were transgressions from 100 years ago. What's in it for progressive whites? Progressive whites are able to universalize themselves as the racial saviors to the world. They're the only group who claim to prefer other racial groups to their own. No other racial group does this. And so they claim to be the truly transcendent race that transcends race in their anti-whiteness. And what we see is their greatest hostility and hatred is reserved for middle-class whites who they seek to eradicate or enslave. It also means that to undergo these confessions of privilege is a way of justifying unproductive yet high-paying jobs, jobs that pay 50 to 70% of workers in the private sector. And what's their expertise in? Equity, diversity? These are a series of mystical and magical rights. And so you claim your expertise in something like equity to be able to make decisions about others in the workplace and how they should run their lives. It's a priesthood that goes sniffing through private lives to look for original sins of racism or genderism. The problem with the teaching of systemic racism is that it doesn't mean legal or ethical inequality. It tautologically refers to anyone who's white. Here I'll quote from Ibram X. Kendi's definition of racism. Quote, "Racism is a powerful collection of racist policies that lead to racial inequality and are substantiated by racist ideas. It's a perfect tautology, and yet they pay this man tens of thousands of dollars to go into corporations and to spew this nonsense." And so what the experts do is they look for racism in the recesses of the unconscious mind of the individual. Or instead of pointing out concrete acts of racism or examples of racism, they say that it's systemic. And that way they can avoid an argument about concrete examples of racism that could be solved. So in defining systemic racism, there's a problem with the word racist. If racism refers to preference, it would mean that almost all Americans are racist. According to 2016 numbers, only 12% of intermarried couples were in interracial relationships. That would mean that 88% of married couples are by definition racist. If we're talking about systemic racism, it's never applied consistently. Racism and our understanding of it, systemic racism, is not applied to middle-class blacks who are doing well, nor is it applied to groups that outperform whites. How do we understand Asians? And of course, there are various Asian groups within that name, some of them doing very well, some of them doing not so well. Does it apply to Taiwanese or Egyptians whose median household income is far higher than that of whites? Does it apply to Asians whose IQ scores or admittance to MIT are disproportionate and who are doing very well? Does it apply to African Nigerians who outperform whites in Britain in academic tests? Rather, what we find is systemic racism is an appeal to a religious authority, and often it justifies the privilege of middle and upper class blacks. It's able to paper over the vast divide of privileged minorities and privileged whites who have nothing in common with the underclass blacks or the oppressed communities they claim to represent. For example, if you look at Barack Obama or Kamala Harris, they have nothing in common with underclass blacks, and yet they claim by systemic racism to be able to share in some of the worst aspects of growing up in a poor neighborhood in the outskirts of a large city. So instead of improving the lives of underclass blacks, what you find are all these token ways to improve esteem. Things like celebrating Juneteenth, things like capitalizing the word black, and all of these ways of celebrating one's self as participating in a particular group, as if you yourself had achieved all of its accomplishments. There's also the claim that's made that police are killing and hunting black men for sport. But the claim of systemic police racism has real problems. There are about 1,000 police killings each year out of some 10 million arrests. There's a stable ratio of 50% white and 25% black. If we look at the police killings of unarmed whites and blacks in 2019, police killed 12 unarmed blacks and 26 unarmed whites. And all this despite the fact that blacks are 7 to 10 times more likely than whites to commit violent crime. The media ignores the 8,000 deaths of blacks at black hands every year, and it conceals violence to whites. If we were to look at interracial violent crime, considering whites and blacks are responsible for 90% of it. In 2018, blacks committed 537,204 of the 593,598 interracial violent crimes, 90% of them. But the media does its best to block out the percentage of blacks involved in violent crime. When we hear stories about quote-unquote youths involved in flash mobs or cafeteria riots, the race is always excluded. If we look at the possibly racially motivated killing of whites and young whites at the Waukesha parade by Darrell Brooks, the New York Times didn't even mention the race of Darrell Brooks. If you were to tally the excess number of deaths of whites at the hands of blacks just over the last 12 years, it would be more deaths than all of the blacks lynched in American history, according to NAACP numbers. The argument that's been made by Ta-Nehisi Coates and others that blacks built the country and therefore entitled to reparations. In fact, Ta-Nehisi Coates says it's possible whites may never be able to repay blacks for all the pain and suffering that they've caused. But if you actually look at the claim that blacks built the country, it's not true. Blacks built some of the country. Here we refer to enslaved blacks. Slaves accounted for only about 5% of GDP in 1836. Cotton accounted for only about 5% of GDP in 1860 at the outbreak of the Civil War. Rather, it was northern industry that provided for 90% of the nation's manufacturing output. The source of the nation's wealth was not the agrarian economy or the slave economy. Rather, it was the innovation that was launched in industrial production throughout the 19th century, by the end of which America was the world's leading industrial and agricultural producer. To the claim that blacks are entitled to reparations, Woodson argues that $22 trillion have already been paid out in entitlements since the 1960s, the Great Society and beyond. However, 70% of those payments have gone to the, quote, poverty industry, meaning to administrators, social workers, and bureaucrats, which claim to be helping the least among us, but really reserve to themselves positions of wealth and privilege. And so we see that the black underclass is not a bug, it's a feature of identity politics, where those who are oppressed, the black underclass, are actually doing far worse than they were before. You're talking about a group who at the junior high level, African Americans, have an 85% functional illiteracy rate and are failing at math. When we look at the conservative response to the Great Awakening and the political regime that was created by it, conservatives need to take heart in the fact that the emperor has no clothes. We're talking about a regime that is filled with failures and has lost all legitimacy. In Thomas Dye's assessment, 2,000 of the 4,000 most powerful Americans receive their education at just 12 universities. 77% of wealthy Americans send their children to Ivy League schools. And yet we find at these schools, we see that they're setting aside all of the testing and the standards that would bring in the smartest, the most capable and intelligent Americans. We find that Asians are underrepresented at Ivy League schools like Harvard, and that a vast number of their students are legacy students. Not to mention, top-tier schools have decided they're going to get rid of the analytic tests or the standardized test that used to be required for admittance. And why? Well, it's because they don't want to have to report that they're accepting a subpar generation of students. When we look at the basic functioning of the country, we see that there's vast incompetence. Civil engineers frequently give the United States infrastructure a C- to a D+ rating, as its roads, its bridges, its sewer lines are crumbling. The TSA is a good example. Despite having a $9 billion budget, it has an 80 to 97% failure rate at discovering weapons. At the most basic level, we find mismanagement of the economy and monetary policy. Americans are now seeing high peak rates of inflation that we haven't seen since the 1970s as stagflation rolls in once again. And of course, now we see a resurgence in crime. All of the incompetent people who talked about defunding the police and yet securing for themselves their own private armies of guards, well-armed guards, are the same people who have allowed those cities to be held hostage by criminals once again, as they were in the late 70s. If we look at American happiness, we find that Americans are plagued by broken families. What has this led to, this supposed sexual revolution? Well, it's led to a de facto polygamy for the elite in urban areas. It means that women's self-reported rates of happiness for decades and decades have been declining. It's odd that women who talk about how free they are to enslave themselves to corporations so they can accumulate baubles for capitalistic consumption believe that they're freer than women who dedicate themselves to the moral and health development of their own children. When we look at men, men are performing miserably. They underperform women academically, in terms of admission rates to colleges, performance in colleges and at schools. 20% of all American boys are diagnosed with ADHD before they reach high school. And of course, it's boys disproportionately who are prescribed Adderall. These are mind-altering drugs so that they can sit sedately in school. Americans on the whole are doing very poorly if we consider statistics like suicide and fentanyl. In 2021, there were 110,000 deaths by fentanyl. There were 45,000 suicides in 2020 as people see a loss of life and meaning. And yet, if you listen to the media, all they focus on are the deaths that will help them gain political power. In terms of the military, what we've seen is a woke revolution that's taken hold of the officer corps. West Point brings in Ta-Nehisi Coates to give a lecture to the future leaders of the American military on white racism and how it infects the American founding. What we find is the American military spending billions on sex reassignment surgery. The withdrawal from Afghanistan, which was a mistake to go into in the first place, gives you an idea of the incompetence of the military. At West Point, the Western civilization class is called derisively the I Hate America class. It gives you an example as to how thoroughly identity politics has infiltrated these institutions of higher learning. So what are conservatives to do? I think that the first thing conservatives should do is to commence in a thorough critique of all of the reigning institutions. Is America a republic? Not really. In a republic, you would have laws that are passed by duly elected representatives. Instead, we have lawmaking power delegated to large bureaucracies, to agencies, boards, and commissions, by those who have no accountability, literally the definition that Madison provides in Federalist 47 and 48 of tyranny. Is America democracy? Hardly. Democracy would mean rule by the people, by the majority of people. Rather, what we find is a ruling class that claims to rule in the name of the people, except for when it doesn't. If you look at, say, California's Prop 8, you find a ruling class that overturns the people's will on issues like gay marriage, or even today in the abortion case. Democracy is not to be turned to make those kinds of decisions at the state level. When it comes to trans rights, there was never a kind of popular forum where the majority would rule in that decision. When it comes to the U.S. supporting Ukraine in the war against Russia, essentially launching into a war against Russia on our own, that was never turned over to the public for a popular decision. And so a thorough critique of American institutions urges us to go back to the founders' understanding of what Republican institutions were and what the mindset and the habits of a Republican citizen are. The most important thing is to understand how radical republicanism is. Radical. The American founders knew that Republican virtues and the kinds of civil liberties and rights that they were urging were very rare. Rather, the norm in human history is oppression and tyranny. And they distinguished their own rights that they had as citizens from those of subjects. They called it the citizenship revolution. Under the British Empire, an expansive empire, and empires always love to be diverse. They like to cram all different kinds of people into their borders, and they like to assign them various privileges according to these overlapping identities, whether one is in an aristocracy, whether one lives in a colony, and so on. But the American founders argued for equal citizenship rights under the law. Of course, the function assigning these various rights and identities is for the better control of the subjects. And so Americans should look back to their own Republican institutions and traditions. And in doing so, they need to regain a knowledge of the things that secured their liberty. Christians need to understand their own traditions and to revive those traditions at the local level and to see how they've been stolen away from them. For example, if you look at the COVID-19 lockdowns, where Christians were barred from going to their own churches, even as Home Depot was called essentialist and allowed to remain open. And it's not just a Christian tradition. It's also a natural rights and a natural law tradition. To understand on the side of the right that certain rights are not subject to negotiation and that there's a right to revolution in the protection of those essential liberties. Another thing conservatives need to do is not to ignore national politics, but also to look locally. They need to form their own communities, to understand that empires rule by alienating and weakening and isolating their own subjects. And so conservatives need to focus on forming local communities, close friends. Men need to focus on male networks, working out with one another, purchasing AR-15s and training. And by this, I don't mean Fed posting FBI-infiltrated militias. What should encourage conservatives is that they own all the American symbols. The left has willingly given them up. The left hates America. The only way they like America is insofar as they can talk about how America genuflects or prostrates itself before their visions of a better global community or wokeness. As conservatives form their own communities, they could focus on creating their own separate institutions, things like charter schools, things like co-ops for agriculture and produce, things like private business, working and networking with one another. They also should look to empowering themselves at the local level, not just at the city and the county level, but understand that during the COVID coup of 2020, we witnessed at the red state level and at the local community level probably the greatest act of civil disobedience in American history. For all of those tired, poor, huddling masses in the urban areas who were masking up, they lived life completely different than those of us who lived out in the provinces. Essentially, we ignored all the mandates of our governors, we ignored federal mandates, and we're able to practice our own way of life, separate from those in the cities. We see some encouraging news in the response from 2020. Red state governors like Ron DeSantis are able to turn on the corporations that oppose all of those who vote Republican within their own states. Probably the best piece of advice to conservatives is to stop apologizing for everything. To stop apologizing for the color of your skin or for your religion. Understand that the tyranny you saw in 2020 is what the left has in store for you. A constant apology, constant subjugation, and a deprivation of all of your rights. If conservatives are going to restore the rights that they obtained through the citizenship revolution, what it means is they need to reclaim sovereignty from the bureaucracy itself. who's lost all legitimacy and has no basis left to claim the right to rule. And so to conclude this class, which focuses on the break from the 1960s radicals, from the 1950s liberals, one of the most important points is that both of those groups created a bureaucracy that is now taking rights away from their citizens, and that the citizenship rights that we have are antithetical to the administrative state. And so while what I've said might sound very divisive, the most important message for conservatives is if they are going to come to a common understanding with those in the center or even on the left, they have to negotiate from a position of strength. And only then will they be able to secure the rights that they have as American citizens collectively. And so Americans need to understand that the Western heritage is not some abstraction. It literally exists in them, in their own flesh and blood. And they can look back to their own founders to get some good advice as to how they should proceed. And here I'd like to conclude with a quote by Abigail Adams to her son. "These are times in which a genius would want to live. It is not in the still calm of life or the repose of a Pacific station that great characters are formed. The habits of a vigorous mind are formed in contending with difficulties. All history will convince you of this, and that wisdom and penetration are the fruit of experience, not the lessons of retirement and leisure. Great necessities call out great virtues. When a mind is raised and animated by scenes that engage the heart, then those qualities, which would otherwise lie dormant, wake into life and form the character of the hero and the statesman. War, tyranny, and desolation are the scourges of the Almighty, and ought no doubt to be deprecated. Yet it is your lot, my son, to be an eyewitness of these calamities in your own native land, and at the same time to owe your existence among a people who have made a glorious defense of their invaded liberties, and who, aided by a generous and powerful ally, with the blessing of heaven, will transmit this inheritance to ages yet unborn." Let's heed the advice of Abigail Adams. Thank you for joining us.